right, hey y'all, thank you for joining us in C4. This is the best room, and thank you for coming to Jfokus. Now I'd love to introduce our last session of the day before the keynote, Ivar.
Thank you very much. Okay, so this talk is called How to be a Responsible Open Source Citizen. My name is Ivar Grimstad. I'm the Jakarta developer advocate at Eclipse Foundation. I am on social media, on Twitter, Mastodon, GitHub, LinkedIn, etc. I won't spend time on this slide because we have a lot of stuff to go through and we have only 15 minutes. But you can get the slides afterwards and find me there online if you want to. So open source. Open source principles. Let's go through these first so we have kind of a little bit of context. And the first principle of open source is transparency. And that is everybody has access to the same material and information. There is nothing hidden away. It's nothing private conversation. It's all about transparency. Everybody sees everything. It's all about collaboration. And that means that in open source, you can enhance other people's work or your own work in unanticipated ways. So you can get results that you wouldn't be able to do if you were doing it on yourself. Release early and often is an open source principle, and that means it's free to experiment. You learn by doing. You do rapid discoveries, and if you go a wrong direction, you just fix it and go the right one. So release early and often is the third principle. The fourth principle is that it's an inclusive meritocracy. And what that means that good ideas come from everywhere, and the best idea should always win. So you kind of earn your credit by contributing. That is what meant by meritocracy. And then it's all about community. So you unite around something you want to achieve together. You have shared values and a common purpose, and it's the community over the individual goals. And we cannot even really talk about open source without talking about open source licenses. And open source licenses are, you can find them all on the Open Source Initiative. They list all the open source licenses, and there are pretty strict criteria as to what an open source license is and isn't. And there is a difference between open source and source available. So a source available means that you have access to all the code, you can see it, but there may be restrictions on how to use it. And that is not an open source license. Open source doesn't mean that you can see the code. That is source available. Open source means that you can freely access the code, you can use it, you can change it, and you can modify it, and you can share it in a modified or unmodified form to anyone, by anyone. So open source is much more than just being able to see the source. So that is kind of the open source principles and a little bit about licenses. So we all know, kind of have a common understanding of what open source is. So anyone using open source? Yeah, so there you go. So let's talk about how to consume open source responsibly. And to do that, we'll talk about different types of open source projects. And we have the solo open source projects, the single vendor, the community, and the foundation kind of open source projects. And let's go through each of these. So a solo is what is in the name. It's about one or two programmers getting together, put something in GitHub, and do it. It can be extremely easy or extremely hard to contribute to it. They can be very responsive, or you can get no responses at all. It depends on where they are in kind of how you do things. ByteBuddy and Snoopy, I'll tell you about Snoopy afterwards, are kind of examples of open source projects. Open source projects, consuming them, have some risk. I don't know if you know about these. Faker.js, Color.js, JavaScript frameworks that were kind of the developers didn't like that he wasn't getting any money out of it, so he put some malicious code into it and affected all the JavaScript community. So open source consuming solo open source frameworks and products can be a little bit risky. So let's talk about the single vendor. This is a company or employees of a company that goes in and contributes to an open source project. It's usually difficult for you to contribute to this project because you have to sort of be an employee of that vendor. But you can always get very good support, especially if you buy the commercial product that they usually have downstream from the open source project. And an example of consuming a single vendor project can be Akka, and Akka, they just changed the license from Apache to business source license. And then that means they change it from open source to source available. And suddenly, if you're using Akka, the open source version, you're in a little bit of a squeeze because now you have to pay the company in order to use it. So this is kind of the risk of using a single vendor open source. If you look at the community-driven, these are a significant number of contributors. It's very democratic, and there may or may not be a formal process, but it's not necessarily around it. And you kind of have to participate to be something, and meritocracy is very important here. But it doesn't necessarily mean that these are always going on. PowerMock was developed here in Sweden. It could almost consider a solo open source, but it was kind of a community around it. But as you see, it kind of ebbed out, and there's not very much going on there anymore. So this is kind of a risk of consuming a community open source. And that brings us over to the open source projects under the open source foundations. And these are very formal. They have very strong governance. And meritocracy is very important. They follow the open source principles. Usually it can be sponsored by companies going together. It's usually very high quality. Examples of this are for example, Eclipse Jetty or Apache Maven are under open source foundations. But they're not entirely risk-free, those either. If you remember from last year, this is Apache Foundation. So it doesn't necessarily solve everything that it is under a foundation either. And while we're talking about security, remember SolarWinds. So they attacked the build chain of open source projects and everything. So it's more than just the code. It's also, so the entire build chain is vulnerable. So when you talk about open source, it's not just the code, it's also everything around it. And there are evolving expectations around open source. It's like, is this license compatible? Can I do this with this license? Where is your SBOM? Can I reuse this? Does this open source follow open chain conformity process? Do you have a process for CVEs? How do you handle security? And all this kind of stuff. That's kind of expectations that the community and users of open source have to open source projects. And how should we meet up with that? And then you have governments coming in and meddling. You've probably heard about the European Cyber Resiliency Act that the EU is talking about now. And this is effectively introducing CE marking for software. And this is, in essence, this makes open source foundation like Apache and Eclipse into software vendors. And that puts a lot of pressure on these organizations. So there are a lot of discussion and resistance against this in the community. And this is an article by our executive director writing why this is a bad idea. So follow that discussion around there, because this is important and will affect us all. So talking about Eclipse Foundation, we're probably better equipped than most open source foundations to handle stuff like the evolving expectations and the Cyber Resiliency Act, because we have staff, we have resources, and we have a lot of practices around it. We have more than 400 projects. It's more than 400 million lines of code, and we have we're almost 50 people working for the organization now, and lots of members. And if you look like at projects at Eclipse Foundation or other open source foundation, is that you have the open source, that blue in the middle, is where members or vendors come together and to collaborate on doing something common. And then you compete on the yellow, the value added on top of it. And the Eclipse Foundation provides all the services around it. And down in the corner here you can see the supply chain security, so we kind of take care of that as well. So that was a little bit about consuming open source and what to think about. So let's go to contributing. And what's the first rule of contributing to open source? Is, of course, do contribute. And where do I contribute? It doesn't need to be code. Follow your passion. Right? If you're passionate about something, it's more likely that you'll do something about it. So I'll step a little bit to the side and talk about my journey and how you can do it to contribute. And who knows what this is? Yeah? So this is Scala. And what is a Java developer talking about Scala? Well, my first open source contribution was to translate the Scala tutorial to Norwegian. And I learned Scala by doing it, or I could write a hello world about it. And Scala was kind of a community. I think maybe it moved over to a single vendor thingy now. After a while, I started getting involved in the JCP, where I was involved in Java Enterprise Edition. I got elected into the Enterprise Executive Committee of the JCP. I was the spec lead for the MVC specification for Java EE. I joined the NetBeans Dream Team to help promote NetBeans around. Then I started Snoopy, my own open source solo project. It's still out there. It's still very cool. It's not very much maintained anymore, but it's still there. So if you want to do it, please go ahead. NetBeans moved to Apache. I've contributed to Glassfish and, of course, Jakarta EE. And so you see, kind of moving around between the starting in the community, doing some solo stuff, mostly in the foundations. And now I work full-time with this. So it's kind of from 0 to 100 in 9 years. And since 2019, I work full-time at the Eclipse Foundation. And you get rewarded for this kind of stuff, you know. So when they kind of collect who's contributing most, you kind of get a cool T-shirt or some stickers or something when you've contributed to it, and you get your name out on a web page. So how do I get started then? How do I convince my boss? Well, first of all, improve the software you rely on. So if you are using an open source framework in your organization that your organization is relying on, well, contribute upstream to it. That's how you convince your boss. We make the stuff we rely on better. So why should you contribute other than that? Well, you should do it to improve your skills. So you'll become a better programmer, a better developer by contributing to open source because you learn from the best. And that's also what you can say, this is education. This is competence building. This is something I'm learning for. I'm being a better developer. I'm easier to sell to client. My CV is better. You build your reputation and you build your career. So how do you contribute? It depends. So for a solo working open source project, it can be any way. But if you go to a foundation, you usually have a fairly structured way of getting into stuff. So for Jakarta EE, for example, we have this how to contribute. There's some videos and tutorials and guides for how to get started with Jakarta EE. And also, show your support. So open source developers are very glad if someone walks around with a sticker with their project on the laptop, or wear a T-shirt you got at the conference or something. So use the swag you get, use the stickers, show your support for the open source projects. It's more important than you think. So to sum up, you have the different kinds of open source projects. It doesn't really matter where you contribute. Some of them are more structured than others. Some of them are more safer than others. But remember, the first rule of contributing to open source project is it's better to do something than not do something. And these are some resources. Please visit the Eclipse Foundation. I work mostly with Jakarta EE. You can check to get involved with Jakarta EE, and you can read my blog, which you can see on the bottom. So thank you very much for listening, and enjoy the rest.
Any questions? Like one, maybe? No? Great job. Thank you. And keynote starts in 10 minutes.